Staying with the cartels, the United States has significantly increased its surveillance of Mexican drug cartels, not just at the southern border, but even deep inside Mexico.
Cartel gunmen thought they could challenge America's finest. They were wrong. When they opened fire on a U.S. fighter jet near the border, they triggered a response beyond anything they imagined.
It's a war. It's a war on killers. It's a war on terrorists. These are not narco-traffickers. These are narco-terrorists.
In a heartbeat, jet engines screamed, Black Hawks thundered in, and the hunters became the hunted. What followed wasn't just another clash. It was the night their boldest gamble turned into their greatest mistake. The desert shootout that brought the cartels to their knees. It began with a routine border patrol, the kind that usually passed without notice. An American F-16 Fighting Falcon was moving steadily above the desert as evening closed in. Nothing about the mission suggested trouble until warning lights lit inside the cockpit. Below, flashes erupted from the rocks. Those flashes weren't fireworks. They were bullets. A coordinated burst came from hidden positions. Rifles cracked, and a heavier weapon rattled non-stop. The pilot reacted instantly, rolling the jet, breaking the line of fire, and climbing back to a safe altitude. After this, he marked the coordinates, tagged vehicles, and reported every detail up the chain. In seconds, what had started as routine became the trigger for a full-scale response. On the ground, people living near the border first heard the echo of automatic fire, and then the roar of a fighter jet pushing lower than usual. The cartel gunmen had made their point, or so they thought. They scrambled into trucks, sure they could vanish back into the desert before anyone answered. But the pilot's call had already reached command. Decisions that normally stretched across days were compressed into minutes. Additional fighters were launched. Drones redirected. Satellites locked on their trails. Black Hawks lifted with teams trained for off-road landings. Ground units set up on highways and dirt tracks. In less than an hour, the vast desert, normally wide open for smugglers, was no longer open at all. A perimeter formed, flexible enough to expand, tight enough to trap. Every vehicle fleeing the rocks left a trail visible from the air. A pickup cut into a dry wash but hesitated, exposing a route it had used before. An SUV pushed along a ranch fence at full speed, believing motion alone could erase visibility. From high above, it looked like ants scattering from a disturbed hill. But every motion drew an answer. Helicopters dropping teams onto ridges, cruisers waiting at choke points, low passes forcing drivers to roads they did not want. As the night deepened, the chase shifted into control. Crossings were locked down, back roads were watched, and from that moment, it was only a matter of time. Inside the cartel's own network, urgency replaced bravado. Phones lit up with rushed orders: clear the houses, move the cash, destroy what cannot move, scatter across the border. But the advantage of time was gone. Their usual routes were already under watch. A truck that thought it had darkness for cover rolled straight into headlights and badges. Another that tried the wide desert felt the invisible gaze of surveillance it could not hear. Mistakes followed panic, and every mistake left a trail that tightened the net. By midnight, the operation had zeroed in on 3 key sites. To anyone driving by, they looked ordinary. But from the air, and in the intelligence files, they were flagged as critical. The first was a ranch 12 miles north of the border. It had a long drive, the reputation of a quiet property, and the look of a family gathering place. But overhead, images showed engines still warm, rooms occupied, and activity that did not match a friendly cookout. Before dawn, operators crossed the fence and surrounded the house. They had already studied the building and knew where to enter. The breach was quick, the commands were sharp, and within moments, the first suspects were in cuffs, stunned by how little time they had to react. Inside, the evidence showed this was not a safe house, but a command post. Maps stretched across walls, tracing smuggling routes through 4 states. Drawers and safes held ledgers that went beyond product. They contained names, payments, and connections to officials who looked the other way. Weapons were filled crates, rifles, rocket launchers, spare barrels, and belts of ammunition designed for long firefights. This was preparation for battles, not intimidation. 15 miles away, a warehouse disguised as a trucking hub was next. The door lifted, and the smell of chemicals and plastic filled the air. Pallets lined up like a supermarket aisle. Bricks of powder, bundles of pills, all packaged for easy movement into towns across the country. The numbers were staggering, but more than the weight or count, the reality was visible. This was the supply that had been pouring into neighborhoods, fueling overdoses and violence. Behind a false wall was the part rarely acknowledged: people. Dozens of men and women were held in a windowless room, treated as cargo. The raid turned captivity into release. For them, the night that began in fear ended in freedom. The third location was different. In Phoenix, in a neat suburban neighborhood, sprinklers ticked across lawns and joggers passed quietly. Behind one of the houses lived Francisco El Halcón Ramirez, a key cartel figure. He had built the perfect disguise as a quiet neighbor. His children went to local schools. He waved at people on the street. His business was conducted by phone, never in public. But the knock that came that night was not social. When he opened his door, he was met not by friends, but by agents. He was cuffed in his kitchen, his mug still cooling on the counter. Taking him here, in the middle of ordinary life, sent a clear message. Nowhere was safe, not even the most suburban illusion. By sunrise, the results were visible. 43 arrests stretched across the region. 7 of the people taken were high-value targets that had been pursued for years. Trucks, cash, weapons, hard drives, and stacks of paper were seized. What changed the ambush from an isolated clash into a systemic takedown was how quickly the U.S. and Mexico fused intelligence and acted together. The gunfire wasn't treated as noise to be forgotten. It became the opening that forced both sides of the border to cooperate in real time. For Mexico City, the attack on an American jet made neutrality impossible. Special forces locked down crossings that had long been open, helicopters patrolled dry riverbeds, and intelligence units finally shared files they'd been holding for years. Banking investigators traced cartel money to accounts that led straight to front doors. For once, the effort was synchronized. Legal gears moved just as quickly. Extraditions advanced without delay, and prosecutors built airtight cases. Phone dumps were tied to financial records. Ledgers connected shell companies to deposits already flagged by auditors. Mid-level players turned states' witnesses, giving prosecutors dates, codes, and habits that backed every paper trail. Judges didn't see fragments. They saw a complete picture that left no space for doubt. What made this sustainable was the clean bridge from battlefield intelligence into courtroom evidence. Every clip and call came with an unbroken chain of custody, so defense teams had nothing to attack. That precedent now stands as a model for future prosecutions. The sharpest tools can be used without breaking the rules. On the ground, the difference showed in daily life before it showed in statistics. Corners once avoided at dusk went quiet. The collectors who used to show up on Fridays never did. Restaurants stayed open later. Parks filled again. Families noticed the absence of fear, and businesses noticed customers returning. Over time, trade volumes rose, and border towns regained confidence. Border security also stepped up in a way people could feel. Towers with modern radar began predicting patterns before they turned into runs. Sensors buried in the soil caught tunnels early. Silent drones lingered long enough to spot routines. The posture shifted from reaction to prevention, cutting off threats before they scaled. The cartel tried to adapt by exploring sea routes and smaller ports, but the same lesson applied. Any bold move that drew attention risked collapsing into another systemic takedown. If you think the F-16 ambush was shocking, wait until you hear what happened to a Border Patrol chopper. Cartel gunmen bring down a Border Patrol helicopter. Late on a hot Friday along the Rio Grande, a U.S. Customs and Border Protection helicopter slid over the water on a routine sweep near Laredo. It was June 5, 2015, a little after 5 in the evening. The job was simple and familiar. Check the river corridor, call out what you see, guide units on the ground, top off the fuel, and head back. Then the quiet broke. Shots came from the ground. The airframe shuddered. Training took over. The pilot broke off, kept the ship steady, and put it down on the U.S. side in an emergency landing that looked almost calm from a distance. No one aboard was hurt. No one on the ground was hurt. But the helicopter told the story in metal and scars. Rounds had punched through the fuselage, and one round had smacked a main rotor blade. Investigators moved in before the heat dropped. They walked the skin of the aircraft and traced each wound like a map. Entry points, metal torn inward, composite scraped. They marked the paths and compared them with the crew's account. The FBI set the frame in one clean line. The helicopter was hit several times while on an operational flight along the river. That phrasing mattered. It said, this was not random noise in a city that hears gunfire now and then. It said the target was a federal aircraft doing its job. Local voices backed up the damage. The sheriff in Webb County told reporters that about 5 shots were believed to have been fired, and that 2 were confirmed hits. That estimate matched what technicians could point to on the airframe. Folks in Laredo know gunfire. They know how sound bounces off the river. They know a fight on one bank can feel close on the other. Even with that lived sense, cross-border rounds hitting a U.S. aircraft is rare. That rarity is why this cut through the city's usual Friday blur and held people's attention. Very quickly, the question turned from what to from where. The flight track, the angle of the hits, and the line of sight across the water all pointed south to the Mexican bank. Laredo police shared that early red without spinning it. It was preliminary. It could change as evidence came in. While Washington and local offices aligned their roles, the FBI and the Texas Rangers worked the scene and took statements from the crew and anyone who watched it unfold. That stretch of river is no mystery to the people who work it. The brush is thick. The banks are cut and uneven. Dirt tracks twist in and out of view. It is a corridor built for slipping past attention. That is why air patrols fly it. Aircraft pair with ground units, watch the bends, track vehicles that dart from cover to cover, and feed coordinates to agents moving in pickup trucks and on foot. Then came a detail that stunned everyone. A member of Congress from the region said that a round that pierced the helicopter struck the pilot's ballistic vest. The vest did what it was built to do. The pilot was not injured. This new information triggered the government to send 2 Black Hawk helicopters to the sector. A Black Hawk is heavier than the light patrol ships that often skim the river. It is built to absorb small arms fire better. It carries more people and more options when things go wrong. It is the kind of aircraft you want if rifles and light machine guns might reach you from tree lines and levees. Mexico addressed the incident too. Officials in Mexico City said they were working with the United States on the investigation. That kind of cooperation matters because suspects and evidence do not respect the middle of the river. In the same response, Mexico pushed back on broad talk that paints the border itself as a threat. On the ground, the scene work looked like every well-run aircraft shooting investigation. Teams retraced the helicopter's arc, picked likely firing positions along the bank, and searched for what the shooters left behind. They measured distances. They took angle shots from the suspected spots back toward the air. They combed the brush for casings and footprints. They looked for tire marks and crushed grass where a quick exit might have cut a path. The sheriff's office compared notes with federal agents and Laredo police. If the trail crossed the river, the handoff to partners in Mexico would be the next move. The search for suspects pushed out in both directions. U.S. and Mexican officers checked common crossing points used by smugglers and looked at any ballistic evidence against what they had seen in recent arrests. Long-time relationships helped. A flood crew that had once shared radios with a team across the river might now share a name or a number that makes a call go faster. Those practical ties made the work smoother, while the two capitals handled the formal notes that always follow a cross-border incident. And then the trail went quiet. Months passed, then years, without a single public word of progress. No suspects were ever named, no arrests were announced, and no prosecution was tied to that June 5th shooting. Even in the congressional record the following year, the incident was mentioned, but there was still nothing. No closure, just silence. If rifles could ground a U.S. helicopter, imagine what happens when cartels pull out rocket launchers. CJNG fires rockets at the Mexican army. The sun had barely cleared the horizon on May 1, 2015, when 4 helicopters swept over the hills west of Villa Purificación, Jalisco. They weren't just flying routine patrols. Intelligence officers had been watching convoys for days, spotting headlights slipping along dirt tracks outside Casimiro Castillo. The pattern suggested something big. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, the man known as El Mencho, was on the move, shielded by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. One of those helicopters, an EC-725 Cougar, carried 18 people, 5 crew, 11 Army soldiers, and 2 federal police officers. Many of the soldiers on board had parachutes. Their mission was clear: insert troops, block the convoy, and capture. But as the formation banked, the convoy below struck first. A rocket-propelled grenade hit the Cougar's tail boom, tearing through the airframe. Seconds later, another round was fired, sealing the aircraft's fate. The hit spun the aircraft in the air before it slammed into the ground and erupted in flames. The other helicopters, later confirmed as a Bell 412 and 2 Black Hawks, tried to cover the wreck. They opened fire to push cartel gunmen back. Witnesses later recalled that the firefight thundered for nearly 2 hours. Early estimates listed 3 soldiers dead, 12 wounded, and 3 missing. But as investigators combed the site and hospitals updated their counts, the toll rose. Mexico's Defense Secretariat, SEDENA, announced 6 soldiers were dead. Then, as the days passed, more of the wounded succumbed to burns and trauma. By May 10th, the final grim total was 9 dead, 8 soldiers and 1 federal police officer. The rest of the survivors were stabilized at the regional military hospital in Guadalajara. Smoke from the crash site lingered for hours, and fragments of the helicopter were found as far as 800 feet away. The weapon that downed the Cougar was no mystery. Later reports identified the weapon as a Russian-made RPG-27 striking the tail, though investigators also recovered RPG-7 and RPG-22 tubes. They also displayed 2 law anti-tank launchers, 10 rockets, 15 assault rifles, 6 pistols, 5 grenades, 92 magazines, and nearly 4,000 rounds of ammunition. Radios, tactical vests, and even a vehicle modified to support launcher fire were part of the haul. Some of the uniforms carried bold patches marked CJNG Special Forces High Command, a clear attempt to brand these gunmen as something more than cartel thugs. But the ambush was only the beginning. As word spread of the shoot-down, cartel cells across western Mexico launched a second phase: blockades and arson. Hijacked buses and trucks were doused with gasoline and set ablaze, then parked across highways. By the official count, there were 39 blockades across Jalisco and spilling into Colima, Nayarit, Michoacán, and Guanajuato. The civilian impact was undeniable. Thousands were stranded on highways, businesses were forced to shut down, and fuel stations ran dry. 11 banks were damaged or burned, and 5 gas stations were destroyed. Panic spread as fires lit up Guadalajara, one of Mexico's largest metro areas. Guadalajara itself, Mexico's second-largest city, was choked with burning vehicles at major intersections. Fuel stations in several states were temporarily shut down until the military could restore order. President Enrique Peña Nieto responded quickly. By 1 p.m, he issued condolences to the fallen and praised the troops and police still in contact. Security forces across multiple levels, municipal, state, and federal, were rolled into a single operational system. Rubido, the National Security Commissioner, vowed that the government would commit whatever resources it took to crush CJNG's command structure. The U.S. consulate in Guadalajara and the Canadian embassy both issued urgent alerts. Tourists and residents alike were told to shelter until the routes could be secured. Days later, the president stood at Campo Marte in Mexico City, honoring the fallen in a military ceremony and meeting with families to promise continued pursuit of those responsible. Back near Villa Purificación, soldiers tightened the perimeter. A crude wooden cross lashed with wire was raised near the wreck to mark where comrades had died. Soldiers manned checkpoints on roads to Autlan, Villa Purificación, and Unión de Tula, stopping vehicles for interviews and forensic checks. The context made the incident even starker. Just weeks before, on April 6th, 15 Jalisco State police officers had been ambushed and massacred on a mountain road near San Sebastián del Oeste. The month before that, in Ocotlan, 5 federal police officers and 2 civilians had been killed in another CJNG ambush. Operation Jalisco, the military's push to crack down on the cartel, was already rolling when the Cougar went down. Within 10 days of the crash, the government deployed 10,000 troops and 300 armored vehicles into the state, saturating the region with force. In 2018, years after the crash, Mexican police and military arrested 14 suspected CJNG members in Jalisco and Quintana Roo. 6 of them were believed to have been part of the team that fired on the Cougar. Seized with them were an M60 machine gun, a Barrett .50 caliber rifle, and modified vehicles designed to mount heavy weapons. The arrests showed the case had not gone cold. Just 3 weeks after the helicopter was brought down, Mexican security forces fought another massive battle at Rancho del Sol, Michoacán, killing 42 suspected gunmen. Officials framed that fight as proof the state could still dominate heavily armed cells, but the shadow of the Cougar's downing lingered. Military analysts warned it showed CJNG could train RPG teams capable of taking down aircraft, forcing changes in how helicopters were used for interdiction. The human side of the story never went away. One federal police officer, Ivan Morales Corrales, survived the crash with burns. he became a symbol of endurance as he recovered. Years later, on the 10th anniversary of the shootdown, he was ambushed and killed in Morelos. He had testified in the U.S. case against Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, El Menchito, El Mencho's son. And then came the moment the world watched in disbelief. Cartel gunfire striking a plane full of families. Cartel bullets ripped through a passenger jet. Before dawn on January 5, 2023, armored trucks and tactical pickups crept toward Jesus Maria, a rural district outside Culiacan in the state of Sinaloa. Radios murmured low, engines idled, and headlights cut out as security forces took up their positions. For weeks, intelligence officers had been piecing together fragments that kept pointing to the same conclusion. Ovidio Guzman Lopez, better known as El Raton, the 32-year-old son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was there. Within the Sinaloa cartel, his role was undeniable. One of 4 brothers who forged the ruthless Chapitos faction and carved out a power base of their own. He was guarded, yes, but reachable if the strike came fast enough and the outer rings of cartel lookouts could be blinded. The plan was drawn with brutal clarity. Seal the roads. Hit the target house with a small, fast unit. Move Ovidio out before the city could react. The men on the ground knew Culiacan's history. They knew that the moment word of an arrest spread, the cartel's instinct was to shut the city down with roadblocks, fire, and overwhelming gunpower. What mattered was speed. Grab him and move before the trap snapped shut. But within minutes of the breach, Culiacan lived up to its reputation. Radios in cartel trucks screamed warnings across the city. Gunmen dragged buses and trash trucks across intersections, doused them with gasoline, and lit them up. Streets that should have been clear escape routes for security forces became burning barricades. The trap didn't close on the men making the arrest. It closed on the city itself. As soldiers and National Guard vehicles tried to carve a corridor from Jesus Maria toward the airport, a different battle ignited above them. Cartel units had staged heavy weapons on rooftops and truck beds days before, ready for exactly this kind of morning. The bursts of fire that stitched through the dawn were not panicked shots. They were carefully aimed, half a dozen 50-caliber platforms roaring up at helicopters that circled overhead. A convoy of about 25 cartel trucks surged forward, hoping to overwhelm troop movements and scatter them before Ovidio could be moved. The Army's answer was swift. Black Hawk helicopter gunships banked into the fight, strafing the convoy and forcing the heaviest weapons to flinch. For civilians watching from windows and doorways, it sounded like a war had come to their block. On the ground, units counted hits on at least 2 military aircraft. Both had taken so many rounds they had to break off and find safer profiles before they could rejoin the fight. But commanders insisted the objective was still achievable: extract the target if the airport could be kept functional long enough for a transfer. Culiacan International Airport quickly became the center of the battle. On the tarmac, military transports rotated in and out, while gunfire rattled across the perimeter. Cartel shooters aimed directly at airport buildings to block the government from using the runways and to make any attempt at flying Ovidio out look impossible. Then came a moment that made global headlines. Aeromexico Flight AM-165, a civilian Embraer E-190 bound for Mexico City, was taxiing with families already strapped in. Children squirmed in their seats. Flight attendants secured bags and gave safety instructions. Then, the fuselage jolted violently. Bullets had struck near the tail cone. One father described grabbing his 3 children and diving to the floor as the deafening crack of automatic fire ripped through the cabin. For a few endless seconds, no one knew if another burst was coming. Incredibly, no one was hurt. The pilot shut down the engines and taxied back to the gate. All across Culiacan, the response was too organized to be random. Cartel roadblocks appeared on a grid, not just scattered across chance intersections. Heavily armed technicos, pickups fitted with mounted guns, rolled to choke points. Spotters with radios swarmed rooftops, calling out the movements of convoys trying to reach the airport. Tracer rounds arced across traffic circles. Bursts of automatic fire hammered overpasses to herd military vehicles off main routes. Firefighters and municipal crews went home. Families pulled metal grates over storefronts and huddled inside. Meanwhile, inside Jesus Maria, the target was already in custody. Ovidio Guzman was pulled from a house surrounded by low walls and fields, secured, and sat waiting. But driving him out by road was impossible now. The decision came quickly. He would have to be lifted by helicopter. Pilots spooled engines even as gunfire crackled over the airport perimeter. With escorts holding off the nearest convoys, a helicopter lifted Ovidio away from the city's chaos, banking hard toward the mountains before cutting south. On the ground, the fight dragged on. Banks and pharmacies shuttered. Service stations closed. Schools and government offices went dark. The governor of Sinaloa told residents to stay inside, but most had already locked their gates. Highways leading into the capital were sealed by flaming wrecks. In Mazatlan and Los Mochis, airports paused flights as rumors of spreading blockades spooked air traffic controllers. By afternoon, every road into Culiacan felt precarious. Even streets without barricades were filled with nervous drivers who realized no route was safe. The toll was staggering. 1 infantry colonel and 4 escorts were ambushed and killed outside the initial arrest zone. Hospitals logged dozens of wounded soldiers and police. By the next morning, the Defense Secretariat reported at least 29 dead, 10 soldiers, 19 suspected cartel fighters. Another 35 soldiers and 17 police officers had been wounded. But this time, unlike in October 2019, when Ovidio was released under cartel pressure, the capture held. Ovidio Guzman was flown south to Mexico City, then transferred to El Altiplano, the same maximum security prison where his father once lived. By January 13th, the Interior Minister announced order had been restored across Sinaloa's urban centers, including Jesus Maria, where the raid began. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.